Welcome everyone. So today I'm talking with Liz Chamberlain and Steve Goodbred about their recent work at Nature Communications. And in their study, they are looking at a 2,500-year-old earthquake event in the Bengal Delta that then triggered an avulsion of the Ganges River. And I'm happy to have both of them here today to talk more about this fascinating work. In your study, you're looking at the avulsion or the relocation of the main channel belt of the Ganges River in the Bengal Delta that happened 2,500 years ago after a major earthquake event. So the first question I have is, how can we imagine or picture such an event to take place? Is this something like the relocation of the river? Is this something that happens instantaneously, or does this happen gradually over hours, days, weeks, or even months?
Typically, the avulsions can be autogenic, meaning that the system sets itself up for it, for example, by aggrading the channel belt relative to the surrounding floodplain. And in this case, over time, it becomes more prone to avulse. And from what we've seen in the stratigraphic record, these types of avulsions are more gradual, which means that it happens over time, and the river, because there's so much sand and water resources in this system, the river will backfill with sand. So avulsions of this type are not as well recorded because they look much like the rest of the delta deposits. And in the case of the one we studied, we saw that it was a very rapid avulsion, and this was recorded in a channel that was abandoned that had not filled in completely with sand, but rather the shape of the channel was still preserved. And so we could see this nice like bar and thalweg shape. And then it had infilled, but not all the way up to the top with mud, which is atypical in this sandy system.
The stratigraphy in this area for the Holocene, last 10,000 years is almost 90% sand. So there's very little preservation of typical muddy oxbow bends that you'd get from river abandonment, as Liz was saying. So it would be unusual to find this type of surficial meander bend filled with mud in this part of the delta. So that is initially what tipped us off to head to this field site, was seeing this remnant oxbow in the topography, which just stood out as being unusual. Little did we know what would lie ahead.
Okay, yeah, so let's stick a little bit with the stratigraphy, because I think this would be another question of mine. So your study and all your findings are based on fieldwork. Can you walk us a little bit through what exactly did you do in the field, and what was your approach, and how do you reconstruct such an event based on the sediments, or based on the sedimentary archive?
We visited this meander bend, this oxbow that we had tagged, and Liz can maybe add in some more detail, but it turned out to be what we suspected. We had cored in the shallow stratigraphy and identified the point bar, thalweg, mud infill. Everything checked out that it was this abandoned meander, but this had no linkage to any causative mechanism. So the same afternoon, we were driving out, and very commonly in the rural areas, local households will dig out ponds either for water storage or aquaculture of fish, and often they'll drain the ponds for cleaning them out, refurbishing the soil in the pond. And so there was a pond that had been drained and was exposed, and often we'll stop there because you get this beautiful three-dimensional exposure of the shallow stratigraphy. But in this case, the pond had been drained. I don't know, the sidewalls were dried and didn't look that interesting. And we honestly stopped for 30 seconds and drove past it. And then I don't know, maybe 100 meters down the road, like, well, what are we here for if we're not digging into all the opportunities? So we backed up and poked around, and we're walking out of the pond, and Liz asked about a sand layer that she saw that was cross-cutting the stratigraphy. It was subvertical, and started scraping. Oh, that's just it's just an artifact of pond, of people moving around the pond sediments. And we kept cleaning up the surface and tracing this sand layer down to the base of the pond and then across the floor of the pond. And then it led to this whole network of the sand dikes. And it was incredibly serendipitous. We could have missed it at 3 or 4 opportunities, but that sort of started the whole thing. And maybe within an hour or so of poking around, I think we had the concept of the paper. Liz, you probably have some good anecdotes to add as well from your perspective.
Yeah, it was a really interesting study in this regard, because typically, you design hypotheses and methods, and then you go out in the field and collect and test them. And in this case, we were working on a related but different topic about river channel migration and timescales in the Delta Plain when we came across this seismite, or this sand dike archive. And so for me, that was the second month, I think, of my postdoc, and you know how things take a hard turn at that point. And so it was really exciting to open up this new project by finding this unexpected archive of a big earthquake and of the movement of the river.
And can you walk us a little bit more through the, let's say, mechanistic processes that are happening between the earthquake and the river avulsion? How can we imagine this?
That's a bit of a tough one, because it's a reconstruction that we're doing. So there are always advantages and disadvantages to the different approaches we use to study a problem, right? And in this case, we're trying to reconstruct the past event by looking at things like the width of the sand dikes, the distance that we reconstruct with our colleagues on the paper to the most likely origin of the earthquake, and these sort of known relationships between attributes of the seismites and then the earthquake magnitude. So we can reconstruct the earthquake event in this way. We reconstructed the river channel abandonment by coring it. And then for both archives, we used optically stimulated luminescence dating. And that gave us a sense of the timing of both events and showed us that they both happened at about 2.5 Ka. But then if we want to get really into the mechanics of what an earthquake triggered avulsion looks like, we have to do our sort of best estimate of that, because we're not really watching it or doing a lot of geotechnical reconstruction in that sense. We did look at some attributes of the system to try to make inferences about things like the conditions in the river system that would be most likely to set up for this type of event. Essentially, what are the right ingredients to give an earthquake-triggered avulsion? And Steve, do you want to talk a little more about that?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Liz. And I'll just point out that the key feature was the luminescence dating that Liz led, because first question was, can we establish that the seismic, the sand dikes, the seismites, correlated with abandonment of the channel? So dating was really outstanding in linking this migrating meander and point bar system with the emplacement of the sand dikes. So that was a bit of holding our breath for maybe I don't know what it was, 6 months or a year to get those results back. But the trigger, that's interesting. So one of our co-authors, Mike Steckler at Columbia University, So he had done some previous work that showed during the summer monsoon system, when you have a 5 to 7 meter rise in the water table across the basin during the flood season, that there's about 5 centimeters of elastic compression in the upper lithosphere. And so I think prior to this, they've been considering major thrust front earthquakes at the Indo-Burman subduction zone and the risk. They have a paper also in Nature Geoscience, Locked and Loading is the opening line, that there's a locked thrust fault and you're loading strain on it, and there's no historical record of a major earthquake. And so the concern there is that perhaps the system's primed for a rupture. So that made documenting this event, not that there's been a direct link made, but that there's the potential. So as Liz was saying, one of the ingredients to trigger an abrupt avulsion would likely be that you'd have to have the earthquake happening during the flood season. In the dry season, there's no water discharge to actually reroute the river. So we picture a river at high flood stage and perhaps a good bit of water on the floodplain, so that any disruption of relative elevation could lead to significant rerouting of the water system. So inferences are, speculations are, is that it likely happened during the flood season. That could also present the possibility that the loading, seasonal loading of the water is the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, the trigger for an event that may have been poised to take place. So we wish these were things that were testable. You know, even the modeling isn't really sufficient. There aren't enough constraints to really do a proper modeling approach to test some, but at least all of the observations and speculations are internally consistent with this type of scenario.
Yeah, that's a really nice description of it, Steve. And to add to it, there have also been previous work in the coast in Bangladesh by a colleague of ours at Coastal Carolina University, Till Hainbooth, who is not involved in this study, but he's done other work related to this. And he showed what he inferred as stepwise driven subsidence related to earthquakes. So it's thought that earthquakes can cause this really rapid change in local elevation in the delta. But yeah, like Steve said, it would be a really interesting question now that we have this reconstruction and these ideas to test, for example, through a basin experiment or through more modeling approaches.
And then I think I'd like to ask you a bit more about the hazard perspective of the study. So clearly this is an event that happened a long time ago, so 2,500 years ago, and given this alone, probably the recurrence interval is very long of an event like this happening. But based on your results and based on this work, do you think there are any implications that should be drawn, in particular for this area, towards hazard mitigation planning?
The avulsion, well, it's interesting. So in terms of the recurrence interval, Brahmaputra has avulsed multiple times as well. So probably one of the questions for future research is to revisit known avulsions of the river systems to see if we can tie them to anything within the seismic record. But in terms of the hazard, one of the things that's one of the great successes in Bangladesh as a developing nation is that it's had incredible economic growth over the last 40 years, and they've reduced incredibly the amount of severe poverty in the country. There's a burgeoning middle class. There's a lot of infrastructure being built. A lot of the things that may make a place like Bangladesh more resilient against the challenges that they'll face with climate change, changes in water supply and sea level. At the same time, we know that more infrastructure also can lead to greater susceptibility to damage, and costs and valuations go up. So it'll be interesting. We hope that the study is at least puts on the radar and continues to keep on the radar the seismic risk, just as roadways and bridges are being built, that minimum construction standards could perhaps meet the basic standards for seismic damage.
With a study like this, where we see these coupled or cascading geohazards of the big earthquakes, so in this case, we reconstructed it to be like an M7 to M8 scale earthquake. So that's a really big event by itself. And then also with sediment liquefaction, which we talk about in the paper, but then added to that, this river component, that's a lot of things that can happen in the landscape. And it could be really scary to think about an event like this in the modern Delta. But I think having this information and knowing that this may be a potential for this or for other deltas is really useful, because then we can better plan for it or inform future decisions on management. So with these kind of long time scale recurrence events, we might not know what's possible in a system. And in this case, we have the knowledge before one has happened in the modern system and before it's impacted populations today. So it can be considered in planning.
There was at least one, well, then several large earthquakes in the region, but one that happened in Assam, India, 1897, was established or developed liquefaction features, sand dikes and sand volcanoes across the delta, not too far from where we found this archive. So that produces at least two different thrust fronts, both to the north and to the east, on different plate boundaries that could generate, a magnitude 7-8 quake. And given the bowl shape of the basin and the sediment infill, these are kind of classic conditions for liquefaction. And that's one of the leading causes of damage, particularly in urban areas and to infrastructure. Even just tens of centimeters of settling due to liquefaction can lead to the damage.
Thanks. I think these are all the questions I had in mind. Thanks for walking us through your work, giving us some anecdotes on the fieldwork, and in particular through the implications of this work.
Great, Sebastian. Thank you.
I think that was a really nice overview. Hit a lot of the big, interesting points. So thanks.